pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you, everyone.
So are you filling in for Barry?
Well, he gets here. He's supposed to be here.
Okay.
Roll call, please.
Sorry about that. We're still getting separated a little bit. Okay, Director McLaren.
Here.
Director Hernandez.
Here.
Director Calandri.
Here.
Director Martin.
Here.
Director Paris.
Here.
Angel Fitzpatrick.
Here.
Arden Wells.
Here.
Craig Parton.
Here.
And Cameron Goodman.
Here.
And Pete Thompson.
Here.
Okay.
Thank you, Patty. Okay, adoption of the agenda. Is there a motion to adopt the agenda? So moved. Moved by Brandon, second by Kathy. Is there any discussion? Hearing no discussion, all in favor of the motion to adopt the agenda, say aye.
Aye.
Aye. All opposed? Motion's carried unanimously. Public comments for non-agenda items? Julie, your chance. Public comments for non-agenda items? Nope. Consent agenda. Is there any report from our administrator?
Rob, there's nothing special about the consent agenda, but happy to answer any questions.
Any questions to Angel about the consent agenda? Hearing none, is there a motion to approve the consent agenda items A, B, and C?
So moved.
Motion made by Brandon,
Second.
second by Carolina. Any discussion? Hearing no discussion, all in favor of the motion to approve the consent agenda items A, B, and C, say aye.
Aye.
Aye. All opposed. Motion's carried unanimously. We're now
Recording
on
in
the
progress.
advisory committee. Dennis, come on up.
Dennis Lamro with the advisory committee. I think our memo is pretty straightforward. The numbering is off a little bit because the reserve policy's been taken off the final agenda. But I think other than that, all the committee's recommendations were for approval of the applications.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. Any questions of Dennis before he runs back and sits down? None?
I would just make one comment. Staff's clear on what the advisory committee was looking for on that, right?
Yeah, Brandon. So we're actually going to discuss the reserve policy under the administrator's report.
Great.
Thank you.
Okay, that brings us to the public hearing. And the purpose of the public hearing is approving the proposed 2026 application fee for the Antelope Valley WaterMaster. And I need a motion to open the public hearing. Motion by Kathy, second by Brandon. Gotta wait for Angelica's return. Any discussion? Hearing no discussion, all in favor of the motion to open the public hearing, say aye.
Aye.
Aye. All opposed, motion's carried unanimously. Public hearing is open. Now we have the presentation in person by our WaterMaster engineer. Arden, welcome.
Thank you. I'm very happy to be here, and it's so good to see all of y'all in person. So I have some slides just to give a little overview on the 2026 proposed fee schedule. Last month, we had a summary, a little memo, and a table summarizing what we've roughly in time and materials spent this past year on the different applications and our recommendation for the changes. So I'm just going to summarize that as a refresher for the public. So each year we do the review of how long did we spend on each application and what is the approximate cost of each one to make sure that we're being able to cover our time and expenses for the applications. And as a reminder, we factor into that application cost the time to review and write the letter for it, to generate figures, to prepare for the meeting, to be able to talk about them, and also to incorporate all of the data or changes into our database. And so this is so that the applications, having more applications isn't putting more strain on the overall engineering services budget. Also, as a note, our annual rate adjustments for each year is just following the rate structure that was approved for the WATERMASTer engineer services in the Antelope Valley contract. So on the next slide, I have just some summary of the changes. For new point of extraction applications, less than 10 acre-feet per year, we're recommending a $200 increase. And for new points of extraction greater than 10 acre-feet per year, we're recommending that it goes to time and materials. We found that especially as many of the transfers are for investment purposes, there's more water being requested to be extracted with new points of extraction. And so it does take more time to evaluate that. And so time and materials, we will also be providing an estimate to the applicant. And that's an additional change moving forward. And then we recommended a small increase for new points of extraction for small pumpers. On the next slide, also an increase for new production. We found that we spent more time than anticipated on just about every application this past year. And then also recommending for one-time transfers from over 100 acre-feet to 500 acre-feet were permanent transfers from 10 to 100 acre-feet per year. We recommend instead of having 2,650, it goes to time and materials with a 2,650 deposit. And this is actually because several of the applications in this category that we received last year were either repeat applications similar to past ones, or we had all of the information ready to go, and it really didn't take that much time to do it. And so the deposit would be refunded if less time is spent on it. And I believe that summarizes our proposed fee schedule changes. Are there any questions for me or the WaterMaster engineer team?
Any questions? Carolina?
Yeah, thank you, Arden. Good to see you in person.
Good to see you.
So my presumption, but I want to make sure that you confirm it and for the benefit of everybody here. When you talk about the deposit in these two instances, and you recommend the deposit amount, is that based on the average that it would typically take or the upper limit? Can you talk more about how you establish that rate?
Yes, thank you. That is based on the average that it takes. And I believe for most of these, we just stuck with the average from the previous year when we did the evaluation.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
That was my question.
But you guys still maintain the ability in special circumstances to request a more fee. What I'm saying is right now you guys have time and materials. But I want to make sure it's clear in the past, if there was an application that came up that required more attention, our rules and regs stated that you had the ability to request more money from the applicant in special circumstances.
That's correct.
So this is going to make it just a little clearer for everybody. I'm fine with it. It looks good.
Okay. Comments by the advisory committee. I'm looking at the minutes that speak for themselves. It said 11-0. Is that?
One new comment.
Okay. Public comments. Any public comments on this? Board comments?
Make a motion to approve.
Well, you can't do that yet. We have to go out of public hearing. But Angelica wanted to make that motion to go out of public hearing. Is that right?
Motion to go out of public hearing.
Great.
Yeah.
Seconded by Kathy. Okay. And that is a motion by Angelica, second by Kathy to close the public hearing. Is there any discussion? Hearing no discussion, all in favor of the motion to close the public hearing, say aye. Aye. All opposed? Motion's carried unanimously. That brings us to consideration and possible action on resolution number R2601, approving the 2026 Antelope Valley WaterMaster application fee schedule. Is there a motion to approve Resolution R 2601? Kathy,
Motion.
great.
Second.
Angelica seconded. Is there any discussion? I love all this participation. Any discussion? Hearing no discussion, all in favor of the motion to approve Resolution R 2601, say aye. Aye. All opposed, motion's carried unanimously. We're now on item 10, consideration possible action on resolution number R 2603, 2026 replacement water assessment rate. And that is going to be by our administrator, Angel.
Thank you, Rob. We're actually gonna let Pete take this one.
Peter, your last presentation to the water basketball board out of so many that you've done over the years.
Yeah, it's my last one. So I've taken the opportunity to put together like a 30-minute PowerPoint presentation. No, this should be pretty simple. We have replacement water assessments coming before the board today. A little different than normal. What we're going to do is freeze the replacement water assessments for 1 year. That's the decision of the AV State Water Contractor Association, the GMs. And the reason for that is that the rate has been based on AVEX untreated water rate. And since AVEX switched from a calendar year to a fiscal year, there's been this situation of trying to catch, you're setting the rate based on what you believe will be passed in June. And it hasn't been working very well. So the thought is we'll go ahead and bridge this year. And then in June or July, staff will set the rate using the standard methodology based on AVEX adopted rate in June, July of 2026. And that'll set it for the replacement water assessments in 2027. So this is just a pause so that we can kind of get caught up and base the replacement water assessment rate on a approved rate moving forward in time. And I believe that this was, that there was no negative comments from the advisory committee on this, but we're happy to answer any questions you might have on the replacement water rate or why it's frozen this year.
Any questions of Peter? Any questions from the public? And the advisory committee action was 11-0, and the minutes speak for themselves, right?
I move to approve R 2603.
Motion made by Brandon. Is there a second?
I'll second.
Second by Kathy. Is there any discussion? Hearing no discussion, all in favor of the motion say aye.
Aye.
Aye. All opposed? Motion's carried unanimously. We're on item 11. Presentation by Todd Groundwater on factors considered and methods used when conducting material injury analysis to the basin and any producer affected by pumping or storage. Arden, go ahead, Arden.
Thank you. So we can start the slides for that. So it was requested by the advisory committee last month that we have a workshop about material injury. And so I'm down here to share a bit about it. I have the slides in the packet. However, I want to note that in response to some of the feedback from the advisory committee, I made some small changes, and I'll try to highlight where those changes were factored in. But in general, it is very similar to the slides that are in the packet. And I do appreciate the advisory committee providing their feedback on it. So once again, this is in response to requests that we have a workshop to discuss the factors and methods in the material injury evaluation. And so what I'm gonna go through is discuss an overview of material injury appearing in the judgment, and then discuss what we look at for the current practice for both applications that are not storage agreements and ones that when we have done water banking storage agreements. Discuss a bit about the model use and the limitations, and also share some thoughts regarding material injury for the carryover storage agreements. I want to emphasize that I'm focusing on the physical properties of the basin and the material injury analyses, and really mindful to not be sharing legal opinions and not overstep in that regard. And there's also a lot of other items that if we had all day, we could get into the weeds on, but I'm also mindful to sort of stay within these topics just because of the need to keep the meeting moving along, be respectful of time. And there will be a time for questions at the end, and I look forward to the discussion. So the next slide discusses an overview of the definition of material injury in the judgment. This is just what it says in paragraph 3.5.18.1. Material injury is really when there's material physical harm to the basin, and this includes overdraft, degradation of groundwater quality, liquefaction, land subsidence, or other material injury caused by elevated or lowered groundwater levels. It notes that this does not include economic injury that results from other than direct physical causes. So once again, an emphasis on the direct physical causes of material injury. Also, it was noted in the advisory committee that in the next part of the judgment in 3.5.18.2, there is a note that material injury can be mitigated. And I won't be getting into the nitty-gritty of mitigation in this presentation. So the next slide, this is just listing the points in the judgment when material injury analysis is required. And I had started out by going through every single part in the judgment when material injury is mentioned and realized, oh boy, this is really getting into the weeds. There's some very specific cases that come up, such as if non-stipulating parties have 7% or more of the native safe yield. And once again, I won't be getting into those weeds, but the most often situations where material injury analysis is required are in order of how they appear in the judgment, when storage agreements on imported water, storage agreements of carryover, transfers, changes in points of extraction or new wells, or new production. So the next slide.
I'm sorry, Artie, can you remind us how you wanted questions? You want to go through it and then we refer back?
Yeah, it would be best at the end, just because I don't want to get too, have it stretch on too long.
Okay.
Thanks. So currently when we look at material injury, we're really focused on the local impacts. While it does say overdraft is one of the potential things to look at for material injury, we note that with the rules in the judgment, the rules and regulations, and also reviewing applications, we're making sure that requests for new points of extraction are used within the water rights that the party has. Or for the instance of new production, they're required to pay replacement water assessments. So the two things that we're really paying attention to, the physical impacts that are most likely for most applications are declining groundwater levels and subsidence. Specifically for declining groundwater levels, this is if the groundwater levels have declined to an extent where a party isn't able to produce from their well. This would be if groundwater levels get so low that the well has dried up, or it's really becoming harder for them to pump from their well. And so I'm going to dig a little bit more into both declining groundwater levels and subsidence. On the next slide, for declining groundwater levels, I first just want to point out that we can't prevent any declining groundwater levels at all. That's outside of our scope. If there is an increase in production anywhere without an equal increase in recharge, groundwater levels will decline locally. They will decrease. And not all groundwater level declines are continuous, nor does that automatically count as material injury. So if you think about if you've got a well and you start it pumping, you're going to see that groundwater level go down really quickly at first, and then over time, it's going to even out. That it's going to stop significantly declining. It might decline very slowly to a point where over time it's not really noticeable. If we think about how groundwater levels are declining physically in the aquifer. I have this figure here that shows what we call a cone of depression. This is the groundwater levels surrounding the well, where they're lower near the well. And this is any pumping well has a cone of depression where it's extracting the water from. And the way that this looks can vary. That depends on, for example, the aquifer properties. If it's an aquifer that has a lot of sandy materials and gravels, that cone of depression is going to be a little bit shallower, so groundwater levels nearby won't be as low, but it's going to spread out wider. While if water isn't transmitted as easily through the sediments, it's going to be a bit deeper and steeper because it's drawing groundwater from directly surrounding the well instead of sort of widening. We also might look at recent groundwater level trends can tell us about what the groundwater level decline might look like. If we see a hydrograph showing the water levels over time and it's stable, even though, our well in question, the records show that its production levels have varied over time pretty widely, but the nearby water levels aren't responding to that. That can tell us that, okay, an increase in pumping isn't likely to have a big impact on water levels where that monitoring well is. And also information about, well, what is the proposed production volume? How deep are wells in the area can tell us a lot about what groundwater levels and the risk for drying up wells might look like. And so on the next slide, the first question is really, is a hypothetical increase in pumping going to cause or exacerbate local groundwater level declines? And so we first want to understand the scale of the planned production versus existing production. And then we can look at the closest hydrographs to understand the local groundwater level trends. And then another part of our analysis is we want to look at the proximity to what we call barriers. This would be faults, shallow bedrock, or any sort of disconnection from the main aquifer. And in this figure here, you can see that cone of depression near the well that's drawn. And there's the big blob that says impermeable or confining material. In Antelope Valley, that would be outcropping bedrock, this big boundary. And you can see that the water levels in the cone are lower near where there is this barrier, because instead of the well being able to draw from a wider area and spread out with that cone, it's only able to draw from directly the area, which causes the water levels near this boundary to decline. And so that's another circumstance where the setting can impact how we would expect groundwater levels to behave. And so if groundwater levels are expected to decline, on the next slide, we have the question of, well, will this impact another party's well and produce, and their impact to produce water? And so the first thing is to identify the nearby wells. Who's there? We do note that small pumpers are more likely to have shallower wells and be more vulnerable to local impacts. And then if there is a well in question that might be of concern, there are some pretty simple calculations that we can do with estimates about what the aquifer properties are. These are called distance drawdown calculations, where we can estimate using some formulas and the proposed pumping rate, how water levels might decline at different distances. And this does take some information about the aquifer properties. If pumping test results are available, that's really the best data we can get. But we could also make some estimates based off of well logs, or even look at the model and see what are the parameters for how easily can water be transmitted through the aquifer based on the model parameters. And so the other big issue that we look at on the next slide is subsidence. And I apologize in advance, there's a little bit of a physics lesson here. So what we want to know with subsidence is the production going to cause groundwater levels to drop below the historical minimum? And the reason why we have that historical minimum as the value of concern is because we get permanent inelastic subsidence when water levels drop below what's called the critical head, or the water level. This is the water level where once water is slower than this, there's the risk of subsidence occurring. And in many cases, it's irreversible. This is because subsidence typically occurs when there's clay layers. And you can see in this picture, it zooms in on the clay. And the particles of clay, they're not like grains of sand, they're more like little plates. And there's a lot of water that's sort of holding them up in a random array. And so there's a couple of different forces that's working on these tiny little flat particles. You know, you have all of the pressure from above. All of those sediments above them are causing pressure down on them. So that force is kind of squishing them. But then there's the water in between them. And that forward pressure from the water is pushing out. And so it's holding them up in that sort of random looking array. But when you start to pump water, you're actually decreasing the pore pressure in between all of those grains. And so that means that they're more susceptible to the pressure on top that smushes them. And once they're smushed and sort of flattened, like on the right half of that picture, it's really takes a lot of force for them to go back up and get in that, you know, random array again. And they only get smushed if suddenly they feel less pore pressure than they've ever felt before. So that's why once water levels get below what they've been historically, then we're likely to see subsidence. And that's why we have that as the proxy for risk of subsidence. And the next slide, I've got two maps that, these are from the USGS model report. And on the left, I have circled in red. It's a little bit hard to see in the slides, but those are the contours of historical subsidence in Antelope Valley. And on the right, there's a big blue blob. And that's an area where we see thick clay layers in the valley. Geologists call it lacustrine clay layers. That means that there used to be an ancient lake in that area that left really thick clays. And these clays are the ones that are susceptible to subsidence. So we do see that the areas with the clays are the areas where we've seen historical subsidence. So a way that we can test if a well is in an area susceptible to subsidence is either, has there been historical subsidence or are there thick clay layers? And I'll note that water level concerns are more conservative in subsidence risk zones. So the next slide for transfers, mostly what we're looking at really is the area where the transferee's well is, where there is more anticipated pumping or a new point of extraction. Is this going to cause groundwater level declines or subsidence? We do note if the transfer is moving water from an area with a low to a high risk, or what is the risk of material injury with increased pumping in both areas. And we keep track of the cumulative transfers by sub-areas in the sub-area meetings. However, most of the emphasis is on the potential for material injury at the transferees' well locations. And so then there's some considerations of material injury for storage and recovery facilities. These applications, the analysis is a little bit more robust, more factors to consider, because there's both storage coming into the aquifer and recovery taking water out of it. So for water quality, we really want to know, does the recharge water have a lower contaminant concentrations than the native groundwater? So far from everything we've seen for state water project water, the total dissolved solids, nitrate, and arsenic has lower concentrations in the surface water than in the native aquifer water. And then there's the percent loss factor. In the original slides, I'd used the term leave behinds, but that was sort of flagged by the advisory committee as a little bit confusing, or maybe there's legal baggage to it. And so I changed this to percent loss factor. This is really if you're recharging water, the volume that is spread is going to be higher than the actual amount that's extracted. There's a percent loss of the total spread volume to account for evaporative loss. And then liquefaction. If water levels get too high for recharge in areas near critical infrastructure, there could be issues of liquefaction in an earthquake. In the past, for material injury analyses, we've relied on the CEQA analysis for that. And then with recharge shown in the figure here, there's a little mound of the recharge where water levels are higher. And so we want to track, where is that water going? How quickly is it moving? And what does drawdown for recovery look like? Often there's different recharge and recovery scenarios for a big water bank where we can look at, where is that mound? Is the recovery pumping water from where water levels are already higher from the recharge? So next slide. So when we have an application, one question that's come up is, what information is necessary to evaluate material injury, especially for production? The bare minimum that we need is how much, where, and when is that water going to be produced? And it is challenging, I know, for a lot of parties to be able to provide, to know in the future of what that's going to look like. And that is one of the challenges of needing a material injury analysis, is that we need data that we can test in an estimate that of planned production. We need to know the total production rights or if the obligation to pay a replacement water assessment. We can't evaluate material injury if a party is not reporting their production. And then we have the USGS data that we rely on for nearby water levels. So case by case situations, we may ask for historical production volumes. We may ask for transfers. We need to know, where is the water originating? For water banks, it's important to know the recharge and recovery details and schedules. And for more complicated applications where we might want to do a distance drawdown analysis, it's important to know the pumping test results or driller's logs, if those are available. And so we have the model that we've been using in the annual report for the water balance. There's some considerations with it for material injury. So right now, the resolution of the grid is 1 by 1 kilometer. And that is an appropriate resolution. You can see the grid in that figure for a basin-wide balance. It's great at telling us large-scale depressions, large-scale subsidence. But if we're looking at these local impacts, small-scale local impacts, it's not going to be able to tell us if a well a quarter mile away might have significant water level declines because of pumping at another well. It is possible to further refine this, and it is used for banking applications. In the WaterMaster Engineer update, I'll share a little bit about the Willow Springs Water Bank storage agreement application, and they have received a copy of the model, and they are working to make the grid smaller and focus on exactly the area of study so that they can look at more local impacts. However, they've hired a team of consultants for that. It's a time-intensive and expensive process to do that because they need to make sure that the finer grid is matching to more detail in that area and does need some geologic investigation to make sure that the smaller refined grid fits. So next slide, please. So in material injury analysis, there are some limitations for forecasting the future impacts. When we have the hydrograph showing the water levels over time, this is showing us how water levels are responding to recent and ongoing production locally. So we can do an analysis saying, okay, there's going to be an increase in production at this one well or a cluster of wells, and compare it to what has recently been observed with water levels with the recent pumping in the area. However, we're not really able to say, well, how would this compare if everyone is pumping their full production rights and carry over all at once? That would be a pretty complicated modeling scenario. And with the scale of material injury analyses that we have, it's challenging to look at the impacts. I think the term cumulative impacts for a bunch of different proposed applications all at once. We can only really look at it one-on-one with recent data for comparisons. We can get senses looking at the hydrographs of, okay, 2020 to 2022, when we had dry conditions and wells were pumping a lot more, this is how it responded. And we can expect in similar circumstances that water levels might respond similarly. but it's hard to really predict the future far in advance with these material injury analyses. And so sort of starting to wrap it up with the material injury analyses for carryover storage agreements. I've discussed that when you have production from a new location or an increased volume of production or even resumption of production after a long period, it could cause water level declines or subsidence issues. That's what we're looking out for. When we had discussed the storage agreements originally and talked about a proposed order of production that was used first, that would have really made it so that, it's only production that's greater than the production rights and all the recent carryover water that would then be using the used stored carryover or using the stored carryover. So in that circumstance, we would have a sense of what higher rates of production look at like for those wells that can be factored into the material injury analysis. And we can only look at local impacts for the analyses. And we recognize that local conditions change over time. If there's not an immediate plan to extract the water when the carryover goes into storage, if then we wait until extraction for the material injury analysis, we have a better sense of the current conditions so that we can evaluate it. One question that came up in the advisory committee is the WATERMASTer engineer team advocating for material injury to occur when water goes into storage or when it's ready for extraction? And in general, we need to know what the proposed production is going to be and be able to evaluate it about the time that it's going to start. So if water is going into carryover storage and the party says, hey, I'm going to use this within the next year or two at this volume, at these locations, we can evaluate it. But if they're not really sure when they're going to use it, then we don't have all the information that we need in order to evaluate the material injury at that time. And then the last slide that I have, the second to last slide, yes. So I included this to sort of point out some of the physical differences between carryover and storage and banked water and storage. And to be clear, this is not wanting to make a legal statement or really debate, any of the legal definitions, but just to point out the way that this stored water shows up physically in the basin. And so for carried over water and storage, there can be an area that is accruing carryover water over time, but we may not physically see the water levels nearby increasing. Water levels might be stable, or they might have even decreased a little bit. Just because there is carryover water doesn't mean that physically the water levels have increased. Now, to be clear, the water levels are higher than they would have been if that full production right had been exercised, but that doesn't mean they have increased. The carryover is really representing water that, the judgment estimates annually is recharged. The native safe yield volume of 82,300 acre feet per year, the way that it was calculated in the expert report, is assuming that there's an average of about 60,000 acre feet per year of native recharge from mountain front recharge or percolation in streams. And then an additional 22,300 acre feet of that is return flows from applied groundwater. So it's an estimate of how much recharge is going into the basin. And then it's not entering the basin necessarily in the places where carryover water is accruing. And so there is some variance in the annual recharge volume, and there is an uneven distribution between where recharge is happening versus where carryover is accruing, or even where production rights are. So in contrast for banked water, it's a little bit more direct because we physically can see where the water is entering the basin, and we have a pretty clear estimate of how much water has become groundwater. So we know that the banked water is physically recharged, and we can see the corresponding recharge mounds. In the material injury analysis, the extraction for more traditional water banks are really prioritized in areas surrounding the recharge mound. And so there is a little bit more clarity about where that stored water occurs and exactly how much that it is. So that wraps up the presentation. I'd love to discuss some questions with it or hear comments. Thank you.
Okay, excellent presentation, Arden. Questions? There has to be questions.
I have questions.
I thought you might. Go ahead, Carolina.
All right. Let's begin. Maybe we can go to slide 3, Arden. So, looking again at the advisories committee's comments, and their request was the need to reference paragraph 3.5.18.2, the judgment regarding the ability to mitigate material injury. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, so in my experience, the one situation really that I can think of where mitigation was required was for High Desert Water Bank, when we wanted to make sure that they were checking in with the local small pumpers, and they developed a mitigation and monitoring plan. So definitely mitigation, material injury can be mitigated. I don't think we've had a circumstance for a non-storage agreement application that's required mitigation, to my knowledge.
Okay. So I think, and you mentioned this when you first gave the presentation, but I do think I wanted to point out to the public and the board that that is something that is not on this slide and that is in fact in the judgment and needs consideration. I think my question to you, in addition, would be the physical solution only requires the WATERMASTER engineer to conduct a material injury analysis for transfer and new production, and which are some of the ones you put on here today. Are you telling us that you're treating all provisions the same?
What do you mean by provisions?
So all of the provisions that you've listed here, are you treating them all equally in your analysis for material injury?
For listing overdraft, liquefaction.
Yeah, so
those
you
factors.
Said,
Yeah, so I mean, I think that they're all considered, but for most applications, there isn't a risk.
Okay. So I want to make the distinction again between, and this might be more of a legal question, so we can do it that way. But again, I want to be clear that there is an understanding that these are, when you talk about storage agreements, we're including those that may be associated with carryover water, right?
Correct.
But are only water pumped to whatever for example, the location has been existing, it's within the same pumping range. Do you consider material injury to be necessary in that instance?
I think that in that instance, if the party is producing the volume that, is their production right or within their past production, it's valuable to know if they're using that stored water, how much they plan to produce, but that wouldn't really need a material injury analysis.
Okay, thank you, that's helpful. And counsel, do you concur with the engineer's perspective on that?
We'll defer to the engineer's perspective on when material injury may occur based on changes to historical or continuation of historical pumping. I'd just reiterate our position that paragraph 15 does mandate some material injury analysis for purposes of storage agreements, carryover storage agreements in this case.
Okay. But you're saying to what degree that might be is to be determined by the engineer?
Correct.
And I'm hearing from the engineer that in some cases it could be minimal or not necessary. I want to.
Yes, in some cases, an increase in pumping would require more attention than an application that is just plans to continue their previous pumping within their production right.
Got it. Okay, thank you. I have different, yeah, why don't I let other people ask?
So to clarify, and I just want clarification, you said production right and you said usage. There's two different scenarios where that's applicable here. You have people that have, it's not just necessarily a production right that they're pulling out of the ground. There's federal water, there's different classifications. So if somebody's, to just use a simple round number, if they've been using 100 acre feet, I'll use District 40 since they're here as an example. District 40 has been using 100 acre feet, but they decided to not use 20 acre feet of federal water, but they want to use their storage water and use the 20 acre feet. There's no change in pumping, but there's a change in the classification of water. Would you see the material injury analysis being needed in that scenario? Because you're not pulling more water out of the ground. It's the same amount of water coming out of the aquifer. So what would you do in that type of a scenario? Or do you have to get back to us on that?
I think I might need to get back to y'all because the challenge is that the judgment does require, to have a material injury analysis for the use of the stored carryover water. And however, physically, it would be similar to if they were just pumping their combined annual rights that they have. So it is a little bit confusing in that regard. And I think that is something that we need to work out with, legal and others to understand. How do we distinguish these? And how do we make sure that we're both sticking, following the judgment while also not creating unnecessary restrictions?
I would like clarification on that.
Thank you. Are there other questions or should I continue? Okay, great. So I was wondering if you could kind of take us through, I have additional questions, but I would love to hear, I know that you've already addressed some of the comments that came from the advisory committee, but if you wouldn't mind taking us through those advisory committee comments, let us know which ones you have addressed, let us know if maybe you don't concur. So the next comment was actually on slide 6, if we could go through that. Is that okay with everybody? Yeah, I'd like to first go through the advisory committee comments, and then I do in fact have all my own questions that I wanted to ask as well. Thank you.
You said 6, right?
The next one's slide 6, yeah. So this is, we have in our packet on page 36, we have the questions that were provided by the advisory committee. And the first one, they had a question on slide 3. I think you already addressed it. And the next one would be on slide 6.
Yes, so I believe I provided some clarifications. So the question is under clues on how water levels respond, looking for clarification on aquifer properties. And that's really what type of sediments are there? How thick is the aquifer? Is it confined or unconfined? Because that impacts how that cone of depression might respond.
Thank you. You want to go on to 12?
Yes, so for 12, the request was either use a different term or better define the term leave behind to avoid the appearance of water being added to the basin when that may not be the case due to water loss. And so I had originally used the term leave behind and I changed in the slide to % loss factor because I think that's a more precise wording. I agree with the advisory committee on that.
Yeah, and I think for that, not only did you change the title, but you changed the question after the title, right? To talk about does the percentage actually, so looks like that was addressed. Yeah, okay.
So slide 16, I'm looking for clarification if the engineer believes material injury should be done when water is going into a storage agreement or when water will be extracted or both scenarios. And so for that, I added some comments at the end regarding that it really depends on the planned use of it. And slide 17 requests that softening the statement regarding banked water that states extraction may be limited to areas with a recharge mound due to active water banks without either recharge facilities or on-site extraction facilities. And that's the next slide. And so for that, I said extraction may be prioritized in areas with the recharge mounds.
Also not limited, but prioritized?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. And then they requested that we clarify the difference between the 60,000 acre feet stated in the carryover column native recharge and the basin safe yield. And so I added the note that, 22,300 acre feet per year of the native safe yield is for return flows from applied groundwater to sort of make more robust how that calculation was developed in the expert report. And also a question about what is meant by assumed when I said carryover represents water that was assumed to be recharged but was not produced. And that's just referencing that there are assumptions about annual recharge that are factored into the judgment. We have a fixed native safe yield. It isn't calculated year by year as some other adjudicated basins do. And then it said the slide seems to give the impression that carryover is inferior to banked water. We should consider the benefits of stored carryover water. And, this is just to focus on the physical ways that the stored water shows up in the basin. It's not a value judgment. One isn't better than the other. And I'm certainly not trying to make a legal definition or state a legal definition for any of these.
That's great. I think that's actually really important. That's something I like to discuss here because I do think we need to understand both legally and then also the health of the basin, the importance of carryover water and the acknowledgement of what we're doing, and then how those that have carryover water can benefit and not become a situation where it could be punitive that it's being stored. So I think that's really the sensitivity there, Arden, at least from my perspective, that and I appreciate you talking about how it's not a judgment, it's just the physical perspective of carryover versus banked. Okay, so we need to discuss that more, is my thinking on there. So those were all the questions of the advisory committee. I don't have any questions regarding those responses. Okay, so I do now have questions of my own. Okay, so if we can go back to, let's see, slide 12. And again, this would be on page 62 of our packet. I think my question here is, have you calculated what extent an appropriate, and it's not leave behind, but percent factor would be in the basin? And how did you determine it more? So I know you've given us new definitions, and you talked about this percentage, but can you discuss it more, how you would actually apply it and calculate?
Yeah, so we did this calculation. Director Urosic recommended that as part of the High Desert Water Bank process that we recalculate this. For reference, in Kern County for the water bank, they use 6%, and most of the water banks in Antelope Valley use 10%. And so we calculated what the evaporative loss for the area that the water bank would be in each month because it varies with the year. And that ranged from 6 to 11% throughout the year, depending on what the month is. And so our conclusion was that the 10%, unless all of the water is only recharged just during the hottest month of the year, and that's it, which doesn't reflect water bank operations, that the 10% covers the evaporative loss and has a little bit of wiggle room that the judgment then says goes to benefit of the basin.
Okay, thank you. And then, yeah, please, sorry.
When you evaluated the water banks, what months did AVAC put the most water in, say, the High Desert Water Bank?
I don't remember the full distribution
It
of
would
it.
seem that the summer months you'd have greater evaporation. Is that the plan? Summer months we're using water, not usually banking water, and Matt's here. Is that a correct assumption or no?
Banking can occur throughout the year.
Right. When do we is there any average year that we've looked at when we do bank? Right.
And a lot of times we'll bank water at the beginning of the calendar year because it's trying to get rid of carryover water in the system. But in wet years, we can start banking in April, March, April, and go through the entire year. So it's really year to year.
Do you agree with the average approach?
That analysis.
Great. Okay, thank you.
And Rob, I can tell you from years of farming, when you talk about flood irrigation or pivot irrigation or sprinkler, you always figure about a 10% evapotranspiration rate. When you use subterranean irrigation, you'll use anywhere from 10 to 15% less water.
Great. Thank you. Go ahead.
Thanks, Ron. Okay, so if we could go to slide 13. You gave us information and talking about kind of this bare minimum and this case by case, which I think is really very important to those that are going to be using it, right? What is it going to be? And then what is that case by case? I think that's the ambiguity that makes people nervous, right? So we talk about the bare minimum. The first thing was nearby water levels, and you referenced that you use the USGS. Do you use other data even at the bare minimum? Like, are you using some of the well information from maybe other reporting that comes to the WaterMaster?
Yes. So for some applications, we do request that if we can use the water level data, we will reach out to the agency that provides it and ask their permission, especially to publish any of that data, because we understand it's their data. We're the keepers of it, but there is some trust that needs to be built around sharing and privacy of that data. So for example, for a recent application with Palmdale Water District, we asked their permission to use and show their water level data from their production wells, and they agreed, and we used it in the application. And it was really helpful because we could really see right at those wells that water levels were stable over time.
Yeah, I think that's important for us to understand because there can be, and depending on location, a lot more data than just what is the USGS judges. So I just wanted to make that point. And then when we're looking at a case by case basis on the same slide, one of the comments you make there is, if applicable, pumping tests resulted from driller's logs. Again, this is part of that presumption that the driller's log would be there if we haven't, when in fact is material injury being conducted. I think that kind of points to that question of material injury. So I just wanted to point that out, that it really may not be available. So even if you point, it just depends on the situation. Okay.
Definitely.
Okay. And then moving along, sorry, there's more, any questions? Thank you. Okay, and moving to slide 16, which is on page 64. And we talked about this a lot already, so I think you've answered most of my questions, but I want to really understand why we need to, so there's a big push that, we set a time frame by when we're going to determine what the water level is, right? And be very specific at time of application. From the WaterMaster's perspective, the engineer's perspective, what I just heard is that might be a little difficult for you because the condition could change depending on what the time frame is before they actually start pumping. I think my question is, why consider local conditions at the time of extraction when that area would have benefited from the increase in water level due to stored water and the carryover? And can't the model simulate what the groundwater level would if no water has been stored or carry over? So this is back to that whole reasoning, why are we so tied to that time frame? And again, before you answer, because this is very, very much a bearing on whether the idea of, carryover water was to protect the basin, right? And to allow it to recover. but it's not helpful to those that are carrying it over if it becomes punitive. And I think that's one of the things. So can you, from an engineering perspective, talk to us about why isn't the model just sufficient enough, one? And then even if it isn't, why have to do it more closer to the point of extraction? Why not upfront during application?
So first off, why the model can't be used to evaluate the material injury?
Yeah.
It's because the grid is too coarse and we would need to, really zoom in on an area, understand with more detail the hydrogeology of it to have that grid refinement, calibrate it for the more local area, and then run the analysis, which is time consuming. We could use the model for it, but it would be thousands of dollars for each analysis, and be time consuming and expensive and computationally heavy. The second question.
Well, so let's talk about that. So that becomes in a cost, but arguably the model should be the predictor, right? So that's why we have the model. So I think my question would be, okay, let's say that there's an agency putting forth an application. The model is public. Can't that agency do that work associated with it, provided to the water master engineer for validation?
Yes, so that actually is being done. So for example, with the Willow Springs Water Bank, they have received a copy of a model. They're refining it. We are working collaboratively with them to provide guidance and help them with the scenario development so that, when it comes time for us to do the material injury analysis, we know exactly what they did. They don't have to go back and redo anything. And so it is a tool if the applicant wants to go through that expense. That is a very helpful tool to evaluate it and run different scenarios.
So then at that time that is done, let's say, and provided, wouldn't it be, I guess I'm concerned about why it matters when they pump it. It's still their right? So we go through the material injury and we determine at point of application that there's, and they put the work in and they're working together with the water master engineer, and we determine that it's okay. I guess why would we change that point of, why do we have to look into the future? They're applying for the extraction at that point. We, as the water master, shouldn't we make an assumption and our model continues that they're utilizing it?
I can jump in here on the future model. On a local scale impact, we need to know a lot more of the assumptions of nearby pumping. We need to know if right now a lot of people are not using their full production rate. And if they decide to do that in the future, it might change conditions. And so we have to make some assumptions on, does that future pumping continue at current levels or at full production rate? Are there other carryover storage agreements in the nearby area that would maybe pump at the same time or a different time? Because now we're grouping all that carryover, not just in an annual rate, but it could be pumped all at once. We could have a lot of different scenarios in the future, and we'd really have to tie that down on what future are we talking about. In addition to what's the recharge like in that year or the preceding years, there's a lot of things that could change between when we do the material injury and when the pumping is actually happening that we could make our best guess, but it's still a forecast. And the further we go into the future, the less certain that forecast would be.
So, and I'm sorry, could you identify yourself?
Oh, sorry. This is Maureen Riley, Todd Groundwater.
Okay, thanks, Maureen. This is Carolina. I appreciate that that statement. I think the concern, though, would be why can't that be done and it done at the point of application and made that assumption made? And the reason why I'm asking that is because then you end up disincentivizing those the ability to store carryover water. And what I mean by that is, so you're basically saying it doesn't matter when your application went in, we might not allow you to, in fact, utilize your carryover storage agreement if, other people went in after you, have storage agreements and they just decided to pump first. Is that what you're saying?
I think it's a value judgment for the board to answer, but from an engineering scientific perspective, there could be a case where there's a multi-year drought, water levels are low, additional pumping might decrease water levels even more, and cause subsidence. We want the opportunity to look at that, and we wouldn't know ahead of time that there's going to be that multi-year drought. And so there's just uncertainty that could occur.
The argument is on carryover water, sorry to interrupt, is that it would have been pumped anyway. I guess this is where we're having a significant disconnect.
I think for us, it's just the timing that it would have been pumped versus pumping it. We're changing the timing, which makes a big impact to the basin. But we're not advocating, I think when and how is a value decision for the board to make. We're just trying to provide the scientific background on what we can and cannot look at.
So I understand your perspective, but again, from a scientific perspective, I think it's important that you reflect to us, the board, as to the health and what I've heard time and time again, and again, this has been asked from Director Urasic as well. What is the health of the basin? And you guys have very clearly shared that with us. So I guess I'm very confused at this presumption about significant risk, about the exact timing of something, when arguably this carryover has improved the state of the basin. You see what I'm getting at? It can be both ways.
I think we're looking at the level of impact and potential risks on a local impact scale. I don't think we're arguing the value of carryover water. And we're just trying to provide with what level of certainty we can make some of these forecasts.
Okay, so
Elena, could I ask you a question?
yeah,
What,
well, maybe I'd like to consider this.
what's your, from LA County Waterworks perspective?
I'm here as a board member though.
No, I get that, but we all represent different, I represent AVAC, you represent LA County, you represent public water providers, landowners. What is the greatest concern you have about how we're going to handle the carryover? And I could ask everybody that, because I think
you should.
I'll say, AVAC's greatest concern, we have a lot of carryover, and I might get this wrong, but I have Matt here that can come and state me if I do. I have a concern that people, and then I take my own concern that people are going to be penalized for having carryover, and that we're going to, we, at the 17th year, we have to look at all this and decide, is the basin healthy? Are all these assumptions right?
Right.
So, as the water master member, greatest concern is we want the basin to be healthy. We want to be able to use water, for the next forever. And that we keep replenishing the water and we don't overuse the water. So I don't want to see people penalized for keeping carryover, but if we have, a 10-year drought and all of us are having to, pump water to provide everybody with water, we have to make sure we don't damage the basin when we do it. And I think simply that's what they're saying right now. And I think we can all agree to that. I think. Well, if we had a
Speaking water master engineer or?
no, I'm speaking on behalf of myself. I think, and I think, you look at AVAC's mission, and one of our primary missions is to protect this aquifer so we can continue providing water and have, a community that's growing and is getting water. One of our mission is to protect the aquifer.
Okay, I just want to be clear that you're talking about AVAC and not the water.
Yeah. Well, and I think that's the water master's mission, is to enforce the judgment, and the judgment is to protect the aquifer. Very simple. So I don't know, and I think we need to protect people's carryover rights. The water master engineer, I think this presentation I thought was excellent. It gave me a lot more knowledge about how they're looking at things. But let me ask this question, if you want to answer it or not. If we find ourselves in a 5-10 year drought, we're all going to have to be working together to figure out where the water is going to come from, how we're going to provide it, how we can do so in a way not to damage our aquifer. And I think that's what they're saying. So
I don't doubt that that's what they're saying.
Yeah.
I think it is my obligation as a member of the Water Master Board to make sure that I have clarification from the Water Master Engineer as to the science they're putting forth. So I don't know, how can I answer, why don't I answer your first question?
Yeah.
So your first question of me was,
what is
what is my
what is your
concern?
main concern?
So my
However you want to.
as a member of the Water Master Board is exactly kind of what you articulated. And that is that we make sure that we are preserving, as we're required to in the judgment, the health of the basin,
Okay.
right? To do that though,
Got it.
I need to have a distinct understanding of the science and the advice that's being given by the Water Master Engineer, the
Okay,
administrator, and council,
okay,
right?
got it.
So, and I'm not trying to be difficult. I just want to be very distinct.
I think this is helpful, the
When
question.
so part of the conversation that we're going to be having potentially in our next meeting is a workshop. And I think it's hugely critical that the information provided today by the Water Master Engineer is going to be referenced in order that we can make progress at the next meeting. So I need to understand they are making a very specific distinction that they are, from their judgment, engineering judgment, that they would have a very difficult time if there is when the material injury is conducted and what the baseline at that point is being viewed as. They're telling us, and I think we all need to understand that is difficult. My questioning of them is not to doubt their engineering judgment, it's to challenge why they came to that engineering judgment. Because from my perspective, I don't understand why you couldn't just do it at the onsite at the point of application, and why you would need so much time. For example, they need to know exactly, like if, for example, let's just say somebody gets, does material engineering, does material injury analysis. We work together with the Water Master Engineer, and it is determined that there's no material injury. The Water Master Engineer is really coming to us and saying, I really need to know if you're gonna pump next year or in 4 years, because that is going to have an impact to my material injury analysis,
Well,
right? Because the water levels may change and the conditions during that time frame may change. That is a significant issue.
and I might be missing something, but it seems to me that if we're in the middle of 5-year drought and everybody's pumping all their carryover, that the water master may come to us and say, you can't pump here anymore. It's starting to cause subsidence. It's damaging the basin. That's what I'm hearing. I don't know why. And that could happen, I think. And are you saying you don't want that to happen, or?
Certainly I don't want that to happen. However, what I'm saying is that what can we do from an engineering perspective to recognize the rights? So they're talking about this, what is available in the basin. My argument is, if it's carryover water that was part of the safe field, right? Why isn't there water in the basin?
Well, it could be in the basin. It may just not be in the area where you want to pump it.
Basin though. So again, this is the difference. And I think to your point, I'm glad you're asking these questions.
Yeah.
I think you need to be asking of the engineer in fairness.
Well, I'm hoping she's listening because it's coming.
The issue is going to be when we go through this, and I think this is part of the comments that were provided by the advisory committee, not to mention others. Yeah. Is that this is very important to them because, again, would this board, part of the role of this board is to protect the basin. We have done so by allowing for storage and encouraging, the fact that, not everybody's pulling out their entire allocation. Now, if by the restrictions that we put forth on those storage agreements, we could do the adverse. And we could then make it so that there is no benefit to those with rights to store water.
I don't think any of us want that.
So that's my question, and that's why the line of questioning about timing is very critical from an engineering perspective. I hope I answered your question.
Us, sort of. So,
Okay,
good. Go ahead. I have some follow-up questions too, so
okay.
thank you.
I'm just, I want to be clear though, that my questions to the engineer are not to challenge the engineer's engineering ability. It is to challenge why and to understand why they made the assumptions that they did.
But
It feels like to me that you're asking me, like, why am I pushing back on the premise of what we're trying to do? And I certainly don't want that to be reflected.
yeah, no, I don't think so. And I know you, I don't think that's what you're doing.
Okay.
But we all represent the different groups. So that was my point. And we all have a duty to
We have the
represent
same.
the we do.
Okay.
Thank you.
So why don't you ask your question since I've been taking up so much time?
Well, it just seems, I'll just ask the question. You're saying that, and correct me if I misstate anything, AVAC has 5,000 acre feet of carryover at some point. We have a drought. In a certain area, we need to start drawing 3,000 acre feet of our carryover out of a certain area. That could cause a problem, I would imagine, if we don't have some input from the WATERMASTER engineer. Are we doing anything to damage the basin? Is that kind of what you were getting at, or am I missing it?
So I think a couple thoughts that have, I think that Director Hernandez's comments have sparked is one is that, yes, carryover has helped the basin's water levels stay stable and some areas increase. At this time, we do not have the authority, it's not our scope to evaluate material injury for the use of full production rights or imported water return flows or current carryover water. Parties can use that, within their rights, within what they can pump in the judgment. That does not mean that the full production of all of those rights would not cause carryover water. And that's one of the things that
Would not cause
would not cause any material injury.
material injury, yeah.
Yeah, that would be something that I believe, and Cameron can correct me on this, but in the judgment, the board has the authority to consider if they believe that, production, even within the production rights, has caused material injury. There can be, requests to stop or reduce or mitigate, but we're not proactively looking at this. And however, the judgment does say for the use of stored carryover water, we do need to proactively look to see the risk of material injury. And so one of the challenges is if the stored carryover water isn't being used after all of the production rights that don't require material injury analysis are used, then it's hard to know exactly what to look at. And that is where I think from an engineering perspective, we can feel a little bit stuck and why we need this information that in some ways can be more restrictions than a party just using its production rights and imported water and active carryover water. And that's one of the real challenges, I think, from engineering, from speaking for Cameron, a legal perspective, that's one of the challenges of this process. But carryover water, definitely the water levels are higher than they would have been otherwise. We just don't know what they would look like if the full production rights have been used. And the USGS, when they published the original model in 2014, they already had a sense of, I think, the physical solution. There was a draft and they tested, with the current production rights, with the current wells, would we have subsidence if everyone was producing their production rights from year to year? And their conclusion was that there would be subsidence. The judgment didn't factor in the full use of production rights won't cause any subsidence. It won't cause any local groundwater level declines. It focuses on the balance of the basin. And that's an uncomfortable distinction, but I think that that's why we have the material injury analyses, to make sure that, we don't get stuck in situations where big changes or a sudden increase is most likely to cause issues. But also the board does have the authority to look at, should we mitigate issues if there is material injury, even if it's occurring within a party exercising its production right.
And am I correct that our major issues with material harm in the basin is the central subbasin? From everything I've seen in the reports and everything, that's where we have the most pumping. That's where we have the most concern. Is that accurate?
That's correct. It's the area that is the most vulnerable to subsidence. And so we do need to be a little bit more conservative with how low the groundwater levels are going. There are some areas, like in the Western Antelope sub-area, where we did see in some USGS wells some pretty consistently declining water levels that in the past we flagged as areas of concern. And it looks like those water levels are starting to even out.
Okay. So as we're going to have a whole workshop on this, and this has been great to help prepare us for it. But as we work towards the workshop, it seems, at least my preference would be to protect the carryover water, but always with the idea that we have to protect the basin, right? And there's other things we can do than say you can't pump here. We can start spreading our pumping out more. We can build our infrastructure so we can use other areas and take the pressure off of the central subbase. I mean, there's other options we have rather than just say you're going to lose your carryover. And if we're looking, with a 10-year horizon, that's what we can work towards, I think. Anyway, I appreciate everything you've been telling us, and I'll turn it back over to Cole.
Maybe before I go again,
Rob, there's
Oh, Brandon.
a bit of clarification real quick. You said before you lose your carryover. Nobody's talked about losing carryover.
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah, I don't
Ability
see
to use it.
losing carryover. I'd say
Ability to use it.
ability where you want to use it. I agree with you. I don't ever foresee losing carryover yet, because then I'll be the topic at the next advisory committee. I had no desire to say lose carryover. Thanks, Brandon.
Clear.
Thank you. So I have another question. I think we're almost done. All right. This is on, 17. So, I guess I want to be clear when you talk about actual recharge volumes, again, may vary. So can you confirm for me that native recharge is based on an average year?
The native safe yield, or the estimated native recharge coming from just mountain front and imported, or
Okay.
sorry, and percolation at streams.
Okay, and the reason why obviously we're having all these discussions is because carryover water only gets stored after 10 years, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so I'm wondering, would that length of time in storage mean on average the recharge volume would mirror the expected recharge volume? I think this speaks to what we just went over. What I'm hearing from you is maybe not.
That's
Just
correct.
for clarity.
Yeah.
That kind of goes back to, I think, one of your questions of me, but I'd rather it come
No, I
from
appreciate
the
that.
engineer. That just because we haven't utilized whatever may be in this carryover over 10 years, you're saying, as the engineer, it may not be mirrored in reality.
That's correct.
So you're saying it's not one-to-one
Mhm.
necessarily.
Yes.
Maybe it is in some instances,
Mhm.
but we're not sure.
Yeah, that's correct.
Okay.
There's quite a bit of different factors that can influence how much actual recharge is coming into the basin.
So with that being said, because I know you were asking me specifically again about drought years and what I would put drought year. Again, I'm looking overall, so I think I want to recognize that also in wet years, that could mean that there's more water stored. See what I'm saying? This is an average storage. So you concur.
That's
Okay.
correct.
Okay.
It doesn't necessarily mean it all averages out in every 10-year interval. But, you know, there might be intervals where there's an average higher volume, and there might be some where there's an average lower. What we've seen in the last 10 years has been average lower.
You confuse me. What would increased flow have to do with storage water? We can't
So-
reassess this native safe yield, but every 17 years.
Great point. So that when I wanted to be clear, Brandon, that when you're asking me about what's happening in dry years, it matters to us in terms of WaterMaster because we have to do things. But the bottom line is the safe yield is what the safe yield is. And so I wanted to do the reverse. I wanted the acknowledgement. You could also have a hydrologic cycle that is abnormal that has a lot of wet years in it. It doesn't necessarily change what the safe yield is.
Great.
Everybody on the same page is what I'm saying? Okay, so that being said, do you have a reason to believe that the safe yield and the native recharge are wrong?
I think that the data that we have in the modeling that we've done do suggest that there has been lower recharge in the past 10 years. I think it's valuable that the judgment asks us to wait longer to get more information and evaluate that. There were several studies that were done at the time of the expert report that ranged from 30,000, which is what the USGS estimated for the annual native recharge. This is just the mountain front and stream percolation. And other experts estimated a higher volume than the 60,000. And so it is acknowledging that that is a point in the expert report that has a lot of uncertainty.
Well, I think again, from the engineer, not from me, I think this is important for the public and for this board to hear moving into the workshop, right? That there is some level of uncertainty. And from your, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but there is this
That's
uncertainty.
correct. There is uncertainty
But
about
that you concur that there's a good reason to wait to your 17th, in your engineering opinion.
I agree.
Okay. Thank you. Those are all my questions.
Great, thank you. Kathy, anything?
I want to just,
Absorbing it all.
well, absorbing it, and then in my mind, because I'm a fixer and try to like say, you know, like what is the question, you know, to fix this. But right now, it's mostly that we're gonna have these discussions. So in the workshop, that we can get to a final product. I feel like we've already made a lot of progress.
Yeah.
But sometimes when you're making progress and it's only words, there's just so much behind the scenes and so much other things in our brains that we really have to take in. And with uncertainty, you can't always just put it down because it's uncertain. So that's what I'm looking at, but I definitely, you know, think it was very good information, and I'm still trying to wrap my head around all of it too. So that's what I'd say.
Thank you.
Arden, the only thing that I can add at this point in time, I'm on the same page of what I've heard with you in legal. I think that the material injury analysis is probably called for it, but needs to be talked about how it's analyzed on the storage agreement. One of the reasons that I think it's called for is you stated an argument that we could be in a numerical deficit as far as our native safe yield goes. Our numerical overdraft of sorts could be argued. As far as the future goes, we have to reevaluate our native safe yield every 17 years. We're mandated to do that, which means there could be substantial changes in the future of our water with development, usage, good or bad. We'll see what happens on the 17-year mark. How do you not have material injury analysis in the future when you don't know what your future is? And I don't see a way around that myself, but I look forward to more in-depth discussions. That's
Thank
all I
you.
have, Rob.
Great. Nellie?
I'm pretty sure I'll have some questions for the workshop.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah.
I've heard a lot of details, and very helpful. What I know for sure is that every landowner who has a production water right, carryover production water right, wants to be able to make use of it when they need to, with the least restrictions possible. That's very important. It's a production right. It went through judgment, 15 years of litigation. So we need to be very aware of that. Always conscious that we also need to protect the basin. So it's a balance. It's not easy. It's a challenge, but we'll do our best to help make that happen.
Yeah. And at the end of the day, we have a consensus of all five of us to come up with what we're going to do. And excellent presentation. We've got a lot of good information. Anything from the public? Okay.
This is Stan Powell.
Hi, Stan, go ahead.
First comment, I think material injury and how it's actually going to be applied to stored water is very complicated. I wanted to give that context. Carolina Hernandez's questions. I'm not positive we are in complete agreement. Perhaps we are, but I very much appreciated the issues she's bringing up because they sort of match areas of my concern. And then after that, I wanted to circle back on 3 of the slides quickly, but I'll just tell you where I'm really focused on each of these comments I'm going to make is mitigation of material injury. And there may be various ways to do it, but I think it's pretty clear that one of the really important ways to mitigate material injury is to have caused a benefit that reduces the negative effects of your detriment when you pump the water out. And so I still feel slide 3 and the consideration of mitigation is going to be important to getting to a storage agreement. There's also a lot of discussion in this presentation. It's by the WATERMASTER engineer. Appropriately, it deals with engineering issues. But I think to get this into the storage agreements, this is a multidisciplinary issue, and it's very helpful to have the engineer's perspective. But I think before we're done, we are going to have to integrate the engineer's perspective in the legal requirements of the judgment. Want to jump to the slide that's already up here, slide 12, and going back to the leave behind concept. I appreciate the language got changed here, but I want to make a point about leave behind. My experience with banking programs, one of the purposes of leave behind is that the leave behind water creates mitigation for folks that are pumping. So again, I think the concept of mitigation and reflecting the benefits of the amount of water each party's put into storage is going to be important to figuring out what the appropriate material injury is. And then finally, slide 17, the carryover storage versus banked water slide. I think, again, this is going back to stored water, but it's a little more complicated. There are 2 columns, one dealing with carryover, one dealing with banking programs. And I want to talk about those. On the water levels for banking, it says water levels are higher, nearer, or down gradient of the recharge points. And whenever I see the words higher or increased or decreased, I always want to know what's being compared with what. I think the comparison we're talking about for banked water is if we banked a bunch of water this year, we're comparing this year to last year. And that's why we see the building of the mound. That's the comparison, this year versus last year. But if we're looking at carryover, that comparison doesn't work. Regardless of what location native recharge occurs, and presumably a lot of it's occurring at the margins of the basin, perhaps a well owner with a production right is located in the middle of the basin. Nonetheless, there is a physical impact that's occurred because they did not pump the water. If they had pumped their full right, it would have been pumped in the middle of the basin, not where native recharge recharges the basin. And the way you would identify that is now you can't just look at, oh, my water levels are no higher than they were last year. They're unchanged because I pumped the same amount. If you pumped last year and you carried over this year, your water levels in that location are now higher than they would have been. This is a little more indirect, but it's critical to understand what the impacts are of the water that everyone has banked. And that has to be, I believe, part of the evaluation of material injury. And sorry for a discussion that maybe was not well calibrated for all, but I want to raise those issues because I have the feeling I'll be raising the same issues later and wanted to at least put it out there for the WATERMASTER engineer, WATERMASTER council, WATERMASTER board to consider as they see fit. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Stan. Any other questions, comments? Okay, let's move on. Now we're on the number 12. Carryover storage agreements for discussion only. And Cameron and Craig, that's you guys.
Yeah, and this is Craig Parton on the remote phone. I just want to make a couple of comments and then get direction from the board about the March planning session. Last month in December, you all considered a template for a carryover storage agreement and our memo on the topic. And through interface with the advisory committee, the public comments, Mr. Powell's very insightful comments and criticisms and constructive input, we developed 7 areas that we think need to be addressed as questions in order to get a storage template in a shape that we can get unanimous consent for. So on page 67 starts the revised memo that discusses what those 7 areas are. And I think that it would be helpful. We've included not only our general counsel memo, but the template follows that, and advisory committee comments and public comments are all in this stack of documents found on page 67 to 82. And I think it would be valuable if we talk a little bit about the March meeting and what all we want to accomplish and what you would want us to do. I think we are very, at least Cameron and I are strong on the idea that we come prepared, even with a draft, a template agreement to redline and to criticize and to do whatever we need to do to keep the ball moving forward. So you've got all the AC comments, the public comments on the draft memo and the template. and we're happy to answer questions and look forward to moving the process forward with your input, obviously.
So specifically, Greg, what
Yes.
what are you asking for right now, if anything?
I want to just set forward what we think the time in March is best spent doing. And we think it's to have a draft template there up on the screen for discussion, for an amendment, for editing, with the goal in mind of moving the process forward. Not that we finish it in March and have a template that everyone agrees on and we're ready to vote on in April, but that's the idea. And I'll just say very frankly, is to make progress with a written document for you all to use as a foil for discussing these critical ideas that the 7 areas of which are discussed in the memo that starts on page 67. And happy to hear, obviously, the board's comments on how the March meeting should be structured. Maybe there's a better way of doing it. Our thought is just that when it's in writing and it's there in black and white on the screen, we make progress in terms of reacting to it negatively or positively, instead of trying to use an amalgam of ingredients and stir something together. Creation out of nothing hasn't happened in a while. And we think it's better to go with the template that has been circulated, not agreed to, but circulated to capture all the issues that we think you all think are important.
Thank you. Comments? Anyone?
I do have a clarification that I think would be important in leading us into March.
Great.
And I know that Director Urosic brought this up and we saw it. And also Director Calandry, distinct clarification. And I think, thank you, Craig and Brennan. I think this memo helps us, with some of the information that we were asking for. So I want to acknowledge that. But I do want to make sure that we can solidify here a question of mine. And I guess my question would be, okay, so my understanding, but please tell me if that's not what your interpretation is, but the physical solution prohibits material injury, right? But does not actually say that the water master engineer must also conduct a material injury analysis for the storage agreement, unlike it explicitly does for transfer and new production. Is it council's opinion that all material injury analysis should be done regardless of whether the physical solution requires it explicitly? I think we've heard from the engineer, so I want to know from council's perspective.
Thank you, Director Hernandez. That's a good question. I think I would categorize as the 2 pivotal questions for the board to consider now, and more importantly, consider at the special March meeting. What this is all circulating around is the language in the judgment under paragraph 15 that states that carryover storage agreements shall prohibit operations which cause material injury. And somewhat ancillary to that, an additional provision in the judgment that states all storage agreements must be treated the same. And it's general counsel's opinion that it's not possible to enforce that provision of paragraph 15 without implementing some version of a material injury analysis requirement in line with the engineer's recommendations. Basically what they have proposed in the presentation that you've seen today. So hopefully that's not too roundabout of a way to answer your question, that we don't see a way to legally comply with what the judgment mandates with respect to carryover storage agreements, absent some hook in a carryover storage agreement enforcing a material injury analysis at the times that the engineer feels they're necessary.
So that answers my question. I don't want to speak for everybody. Okay, so with that being said, I think that is again something for our board to acknowledge, is that you're basing this determination about how we do that based on what the information that the engineer has given you in terms of our ability to enforce the judgment. I heard you say that based on what you've heard from the engineer, there needs to be a hook.
Well, there always needs to be a hook in order to enforce what the judgment says, right? We always come back to the judgment. That's the water master's mandate, is to enforce the judgment. The engineer has indicated that in order to determine whether or not extraction of stored carryover will cause material injury, an analysis needs to be conducted based on a category of information at certain periods of time, at certain points in time. So as Mr. Powell articulated, this is a hybrid question. It's both legal and engineering in nature, and we need to figure out a way to incorporate the recommendations of the engineer into the carryover storage agreement in a way that implements the judgment.
So what I wanted to articulate, thank you for sharing that, is that again, it's incumbent upon this board it's in our judgment too, to understand what I heard earlier from the water master engineer is it depends, to be very succinct, right? And that there may be different levels of necessity and depth to the material injury analysis. And what I'm hearing from council is that that's the hook that's needed in order for us to continue to enforce the agreement, the need for material injury analysis. But that depth of material engineering analysis is not determined by you or the judgment. It is determined in this case by determining what the engineer thinks is appropriate and making that recommendation to this board.
I think it's a little more complex than that, but in general, it does need to be driven by what the engineer recommends to perform that analysis. And I'll just put a concept out there for consideration, which we'll obviously get into in more detail at the March 4th special meeting, but we introduced in the template storage agreement that was circulated for this meeting, the concept of what is defined as material injury information. Basically, the category of information that the engineer believes they need to perform the material injury analysis for proposed extraction of stored carryover. It's not a particularly refined definition or specific definition within the context of the template that's been circulated. So what might be necessary, and there's the advisory committee and Mr. Powell alluded to this in their comments, is to perhaps refine what exactly material injury information is, so then it's easier to determine whether that has actually been provided by the applicant, whether it's changed, or when it is complete for the engineer to make that determination. But then that tips back into an engineering question.
Okay, so again, I was asked earlier why I was asking these questions. I hope it's more clear now that we have to have consideration and ask questions regarding what we want to achieve and understanding as a board what we need to achieve from a legal perspective, but also this nuance on how this affects the engineering element of it. And so I hope that that's clear. The other question I had is, are you aware of any adjudication that prohibits the extraction of stored water for emergency use?
I don't have any anecdotal data about that.
I think that would be helpful for us. So I know that's one of the things, Craig, you asked, maybe prior to March. And I
That's
think
a very
maybe
good.
Sorry.
I'm sorry, Director Hernandez. A very good point that we can follow up with in the next month.
Thank you. Appreciate it. And then would it be possible to have, I think, a single uniform agreement that would address public suppliers' concerns regarding emergency use. And I say this because specifically Director Urasic last month, and others maybe were concerned about, let's be equitable and let's try to make these similar as we can. One of the questions that came out of one of the public water suppliers, specifically District 40, was a different agreement. And so if that is a point of contention, I would like to understand from a legal perspective, I think this would be helpful for us going into next month, is it possible to have a uniform agreement that still considers public water suppliers' concerns regarding emergency use? So that's just an open-ended question. Maybe you guys can consider that. And I think that would be helpful to provide to everybody in March during the workshop so that, we can understand what can be done in those situations.
I appreciate that. And I think that we will look at that, and that brings up the tension between 18.5.14 and the uniform application of rules provision with the mandate to be flexible and adaptable under 7.2. So I think it's definitely worth looking into, and we will do so.
Thank you. Those were my comments. Oh.
Is that it?
I might add it.
Great, Cameron.
Sorry.
Very point blank direct. As I said last time, I'm simple. I asked you guys a question last month. Do you feel we are legally obligated under the judgment to do a material injury analysis on the storage agreements? You and Craig both told me yes. Have you guys changed your position?
No, I think the way I described it to Director Hernandez today is a bit more detailed explanation of why, but we haven't changed our position.
Make sure you guys weren't changing what you had said last month.
No.
Okay.
No, definitely not, Brandon.
Here, though, to give a follow-up to that, I have not heard council change their position either. That was my understanding. However, what I did hear is that the definition of the scope of material injury is not set. The engineer is clear with us today that it is dependent on several factors. And I think that is a very important point for those that would be entering into these agreements.
Director Harris and Director Hernandez, if I could circle back to the emergency question and the possibility of a singular carryover storage agreement template allowing for what the public water suppliers are suggesting. Craig and I discussed that it would be helpful if Public Water Supplier Council for any number of public water suppliers provided written input on that concept and how it could be implemented. I think that might be helpful for purposes of the discussion in March.
I will certainly relay that, and I think you can relay it too.
Relayed.
Relay.
Okay, we gotta move along because there's another meeting that's gonna come up and we need to try to get this stuff done, and excellent discussions, preparation for our future meetings. Now we're on 13, consideration and possible action on new production application in Arden. This will be a little bit easier, I think.
I think so. These both had unanimous recommendation for approval by the advisory committee. So the first one is the new production application for Mr. and Mrs. Hannah Zine. And this is for 3 acre-feet per year. This is a 3,200 square foot single home with a 1,200 square foot garage, irrigated landscaping, and about 1,000 square feet of irrigated trees. And in our evaluation, we found the risk of material injury to be negligible, and the advisory committee unanimously recommended it for approval. Are there any questions?
Any questions? See no questions. Is there a motion to approve resolution R26? Motion made by Kathy. Second by Brandon. Any discussion? Hearing no discussion, all in favor of the motion to approve R2604, say aye. Aye. All opposed. Motion's carried unanimously. 14, R2605, Lane Family Trust to Vulcan Materials. Is that going to be?
Thank you. So this is a transfer that's similar to one we receive each year between Lane Family Trust and Vulcan Materials. It's a 450 acre feet one-time transfer to cover Vulcan Materials producing at a volume beyond their annual production rate. And so Lane has wells in several sub areas. This production is for Vulcan Materials in the southeast sub area. And they've maintained producing above their production rate. If we look at hydrographs in the area, water levels have gone up in this area in response to recharge at Little Rock and Big Rock Creek in the southeast sub area. So we found the risk of material injury to be negligible, and it was recommended for approval by the advisory committee. Are there any questions?
Any questions? Angelica, you want to make that motion on R 2605? Motion made to approve R 2605. Is there a second? Carolina will second that motion. Any discussion? Hearing no discussion, all in favor of the motion to approve R 2605, say aye. Aye. All opposed? Motion's carried unanimously. On 15, R 2606, that's Fernando Moody, and that will be Angel.
Thank you. We have one replacement well application on this month's agenda. It starts on page 140 of the agenda packet. Fernando Moody is a known small pumper to the judgment, and he is requesting a replacement well because his home had burnt down and he's trying to pull the permits to rebuild. And the county is requiring a new well due to the lack of sanitary seal on his existing well. I'm happy to answer any questions.
Any questions?
Move to approve.
Motion made by Brandon to approve resolution R 2606. Is there a second? Second by Carolina. Any discussion? Hearing no discussion, all in favor of the motion to approve resolution R 2606, say aye. Aye. All opposed? Motion's carried unanimously. Item 16, 2607. Angel.
Yep. We have one monitoring well on this month's agenda. This is for waste management. It starts on page 157 of the agenda packet. This monitoring well is similar to past monitoring wells for waste management. It's located at the Palmdale landfill, and it will be used to determine the groundwater flows and also the extent of the VOCs and TOCs. And I'm happy to answer any questions.
Move to approve.
Motion made to approve R 2607 by Brandon, second by Kathy. Is there any discussion? Hearing no discussion, all in favor of the motion, say aye. Aye. All opposed? Motion's carried unanimously. Administrator's report.
Okay, Holly, can you go to the next slide, please? We're going to start with the update on the administrative activities. In January, administrative staff has prepared and mailed the fixed invoices. We've also sent out the production reporting forms to all the producers. And then next month will be the special meeting, March 4th at 9 o'clock. And at that meeting, we will discuss in detail the carryover storage agreement key issues. February, and staff also plans to bring a written request to the AV State Water Contractors Association for replacement water. And that will conclude my administrative report.
Excellent. And then item B, the draft reserve policy that came up in the
Advisory committee.
advisory.
We originally had this item as an action item on the agenda, but we decided to move it to the administrative report. At the December meeting, the board did request staff to put together a reserve policy for review and discussion. On page 181 of your agenda packet, I believe, is the reserve policy that we put together. We listed 4 categories. The first 2 just being typical categories, I would say. 1, the operating, and this would be to cover the budget revenue shortfalls. We set a target of 50% of budgeted annual operating expense for the $400,000. Category 2 is rate stabilization. This would be to avoid drastic administrative assessment rate increases. And we set a target of 25% of budgeted annual assessments. for a total of 225,000. Categories 3 and 4, they're kind of special to the water master. 3 being legal to cover the unexpected, unforeseen litigation. We just set a base target of 250,000 for that category, and 4 enforcement to pursue enforcement efforts, and that target is 150,000. The total reserve target for this draft reserve policy would come over a little over $1 million. And we are asking that the board review this, discuss this, provide recommendations to staff so we could bring back a revised policy at the next board meeting.
Comments? Do we like how the reserve categories look? Do we have any recommendations on changing any of those? I think the advisory committee was wondering how did we come to these things, and
it needs to be, in my opinion, tabled and taken back to the advisory committee because it was.
there's
no action.
There's no action
Yeah,
today. We just wanted to make sure we had the discussion. It was open for the public to understand why these numbers were put in like this. And
I'd like to see it on the agenda so the advisory committee could comment on it.
Yeah, it would be on the agenda for the next meeting.
That's all I need.
Okay.
Hey, Rob, like,
Are we okay with these numbers?
yeah, like, and maybe you're asking, like, if staff can talk about why they chose 50
Or if we feel that's an adequate reserve to have, and I think
Yeah, I think we can, obviously, we're gonna have a discussion later, but it would be helpful just so that for everybody, so then later when it goes on agendized, why those targets were picked, and then, yeah, we can move from there.
Okay, so staff will plan to keep the reserve policy as is and include a staff memo with the reserve policy explaining. Okay, thank you.
I mean, yeah, why 50%, not 100%?
Okay.
Or 25%? And the rate stabilization, I mean, we all went through that.
Right.
That sad time when we had to almost double
Right.
because of the budget, and we don't want to do that again, and that makes sense. Is that an adequate number? So if we're having problems at the end of the year, we don't have to make drastic steps to get more money, right?
Yep, you got it. Thank you.
And then 250 legal, I think we've talked about, we want to be prepared to do more enforcement. And what we find is if we enforce the judgment, we all need it to be enforced. Those fees usually come back to us, and we need to take more action so people are complying with the judgment. And then, legal and enforcement. Okay. I did. And, always legal is a little, we never know for sure what litigation is going to come before us, and we need to be prepared with a reserve to cover that. So we don't have to, again, raise assessments. So everybody, any disagreements with the assessment? Okay, great, good.
Thank you.
Thank you. And WATERMASTER Engineers report, Arden in person.
Excellent. So the next slide, just briefly for a summary of new production and qualified small pumpers. No changes since last month. Any questions on this? All good. So next slide. We wanted to just start providing some updates on the Willow Springs storage agreement. So they submitted, it's not the formal application because that requires really knowing the anticipated recharge and recovery rates, but a draft application, and have started working with the WaterMaster engineer for guidance and scenario development for use of the model. So they've received a copy of the model. They've got a team of consultants who are working on refining it, and we provided them the data, much thanks to many of the agencies who gave us permission to share their water level data so that they could confirm the calibration. And then we will be working with them in the near future to help figure out what are the best scenarios that we would like them to run to make sure that when we do our material injury analysis, we understand everything that's going on and that it seems reasonable, and we can understand what the impacts to the basin might be. And so are there any questions about this? No. Hearing none, moving on to the next item. This is just an update on the reporting app. So I met with Kyle yesterday, handed him over a version of the app that he can sign into with his AVEC email address that has all of the AVEC wells on it. And so he's going to be putting in some recent pumping data, letting us know how it goes, how it's working. I had my coworker pretend to be his grandma and put in information in it and sort of edit the guide. And so our next step, once AVEC's trial seems to be working well, is to start reaching out to parties who have been regular reporters and seems like they could be good trial users to make sure that everything is going smoothly before it's open to the public. And a big thing to emphasize is that all annual production for 2025 should still use the normal paper forms. We're not switching to this for this year for annual production at all. So any questions on this?
I think congratulations. I think it's great progress. Thank you for giving us the update. And
thank you.
Yeah, hopefully everything goes well.
Fingers crossed. I'm always a little nervous when a new person is using it. And, hopefully we can find out all of the little snags to help get those settled before it goes to the public. Thanks.
Great.
That's all I've got.
Thank you, Art, and General Counsel's report. Cameron and Craig.
Yeah, I'll just make a couple of comments and let Cameron mop up what I destroy in this very short report. We have a closed session on litigation items. Just for the board's knowledge, because it's public information, we had a decision on December 15th of last year in the Zermalza matter, in the Court of Appeal ruled unanimously in favor of the WATERMASTER. That decision by the three-person Court of Appeal was requested for a rehearing by the Zermalzas. The court had 90 days to review the request and ultimately denied it in its entirety. And so the matter was completed at the Court of Appeal level. The situation now is that a petition for review by the California Supreme Court has been filed by the Zermalzas, and we'll be preparing a response to that. There is a request within the advisory committee to update on the petition for review. That just was submitted by the Zermalzas about a week ago, and a response is due from us in the middle of February. That's it on the litigation matters. 19B talks about discussing the use of carryover to satisfy replacement obligations. And I think Cameron and I were not sure what the board is looking for under that topic. And maybe you can clarify that. I believe it was Director Urasek that raised this issue, and maybe it's more appropriate to ask him for more specifics about what he wanted to get from a discussion of the use of carryover to satisfy replacement obligations. But absent that, that's the full report. Cameron, do you have anything you'd like to add?
Nothing to add. Thank you.
Okay, very good. Then before I have a motion going to closed session, today is Peter's last day with AVEC and last day with our WaterMaster board. And I just want to thank you, Peter, so much for the outstanding work you've done with us. And what we we all know we had a comparison of what could happen and between you and what did happen. And I think we're all very appreciative of coming back into the administrator position in a very difficult time and righting the ship and leaving us with Angel as our replacement administrator and smooth sailing for our WATERMASTer group. So I just want to thank you and board members.
Peter, thank you for all your hard work and dedication. You will be missed, and just want to wish you and your family the best of luck. So sincere congratulations. Angel, condolences.
I already did my, I already did my personal.
Well, Peter will be with us in closed session too, but I just wanted to make sure publicly we just thank you for all you did for us. Okay, is there a motion to go into closed session?
I'll move.
Motion made by Brandon, second by Carolina. Any discussion? Hearing no discussion, all in favor of the motion, go into closed session, say aye. Aye, all opposed? Motion's carried unanimously. Let's try to meet in about 5 minutes. And I know we have another group coming in at 12:30. And
I'll be set up there.
yeah, could they just set up the lunch? I think we're going to be out by 12 pretty soon.
12.
Yeah. Yeah, this shouldn't be.
Did we split lunch out here? You want lunch here?
I guess.
Yeah, I think set their food up out here and then they can take it in there. And we'll get done.